you build your conviction around it, and then you follow your conviction hard, based on factual things, not opinions.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Excellence in Global Offshore Wind. I'm really excited to be joined by my friend Patrick Samson, operating partner at Sandbrook Capital and former head of real assets at PSP Investments.
The whole industry is in a big recalibration phase. The US has major uncertainties, but certainly the European market, it's become a place where I think there's starting to be a potential, building a platform that can find its way into a gap that exists in the market. Whether there's a space in the market to create the right platform to offer infrastructure as a service.
Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Welcome to 2026.
Yes, excellent. Patrick, let's jump right in. You've spent decades investing, across real assets and infrastructure, and you've seen energy transition platforms get built, financed, and scaled. Today, I want to unpack how institutional capital is underwriting offshore wind in 2026. What's changed since inflation and the changes in the cost of capital, as well as what developers must do to win capital in a more disciplined market. So first, I want to do kind of a market reality check, and in terms of what's changed and what hasn't. So from an institutional investor seat, Patrick, where you sit, what are the three biggest underwriting shifts in offshore wind? From 2022 to 2024, if we look at that, cost of capital, supply chain, offtake, execution.
Interesting question, Philip, and it's a kind of complicated one to answer because there's been a huge evolution in the space over the course of even the last 10 years, where we saw big changes in different markets, whether we're talking about the US, Europe, or Asia Pacific. So, everything I'm going to say comes from my background, and I was counting here as we started 2026. I'm starting my 32nd year of work, and I've done 10 years in advisory across real assets and real estate and infrastructure, and then 20 years of principal investing at PSP Investments, setting up the groups across real assets, but more specifically in infrastructure. And now with Sandbrook as a private capital manager on behalf of large institutions. So if I jump straight to your question on how the industry has evolved, of course, in the last 3 to 4 years, the story's been around three major themes, and then one fourth one that's been added in the US last year through politics. But certainly the pandemic has created what we all know as inflation. So inflation on labor, inflation on cost of input. So whether we're talking about steel or copper or other materials. So that's the one big change that has caused prices to go up in terms of constructing offshore wind. The second one is big bottleneck struggles with the supply chain. So caused partially by the pandemic, but also the structure of the industry. And then suddenly after that, you saw a rapid ramp up in financing costs. And so cost of leverage, but also cost of equity. So those three things together were a perfect storm to big struggle in projects and a hold in a lot of projects. And so you saw the UK, Germany going no bid on some auctions. And I'll leave the Asia Pac market aside. We can address it later, but certainly the European market, which is the more developed market in offshore wind, with north of 40 gigawatts of installed capacity, another 25 right now under construction. So those three themes just put a big alt in a lot of the projects and a lot of uncertainties. And then in the US, in that same period, you were seeing an emerging market coming in, with leases have been having been auctioned off the East Coast, and suddenly in 2025 you see political interference in the space, and now we're facing judicial challenges, and the courts basically saying, "Oh, you couldn't do what you've done on the political and executive side of alting projects." So I'll say I'll close that initial question, maybe, Philip, and give the ball back to you. The whole industry is in a big recalibration phase right now. The U.S. has major uncertainties, and everything's frozen right now. I guess as of this week, Revolution Wind is back on track, but we'll see for how long. And then in Europe, it's really a matter of consolidating the base and trying to ramp back up the industry. And as we speak this morning, we've seen the results of the UK auction, and it seems very positive in terms of development for the industry.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So obviously we track the industry very closely, and so my colleagues and I were speaking about it actually this morning as we sit here, in early January 26th. We saw Revolution Wind 2 days ago get the court order to start construction again, as you mentioned, in the U.S. Today, the courts are meeting about Empire Wind, Equinor's project in the U.S., and then on Friday, Dominion will be getting hopefully a similar result as on the coastal Virginia offshore wind as Revolution. So some positive news coming out of the industry in the U.S. If we shift to the U.K., to your point, the AR7 auction, 8.4 gigawatts awarded. RWE, of course, a big winner, and a number of others. Very, very impressive pricing. About 91 pounds a megawatt hour for those CFDs, and so that's going to be exciting. There's a little bit of floating offshore wind in there, and then of course, if we shift to Germany, we have a final investment decision on 1.6 gigawatts from Vattenfall. So it's been a good week. Fingers crossed. We're still halfway through the week, but so you're right. We're starting to see some positive news. Of course, there are still challenges. I want to go back to, you've spent a lot of time at PSP, and from your perspective at an institutional investor, what do you see as the opportunities today, for mega funds, in the offshore wind space compared to in the past?
Happy to go back on this, but certainly, at one point the opportunity was step up in the US and try to benefit from all the resource potential that exists on both the East Coast and probably a bit later on the West Coast. Today, I see the US is non-investable for new offshore wind projects for large institutions. Whether a strategic player who is willing to continue to step up, that remains to be seen. Certainly, the strategics will want to finalize the projects they've started to build. You've referred to 3 of them, and hopefully, the courts will go the right way. So I don't think the U.S. is the place to go for large institutions. Europe certainly quite interesting. I'll come back on it in a second, and I think very attractive potentially right now. While in Asia Pacific, it was investable. It was a nice place to think about for large institutions, and we had done some steps there when I was at PSP and overseeing the program. Right now, I think the industry in Asia Pacific needs to readjust to that new reality of cost inflation, interest rates, and supply chain issues, and it's slowly doing it, but very slowly. So Taiwan, potentially Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, maybe. we'll see. But I think 2026 is not the year for institutions over there. While we sit today after a few weeks in 2026, and I think the European market has changed quite a lot in the last few weeks, and it's become a place where I think there's starting to be on the new project side the potential. And while during the course of 2025, with readaptation and recalibration of those three items on costs, supply chain, and interest rates, I don't think Germany or the UK were there. Now we're seeing Poland as relaunching its auction system with the two-sided CFDs as the UK. So I think Poland has probably inspired itself on the regulatory front from the UK, and we see that very successful auction in the UK. We see a project moving forward. You referred to it, Vattenfall in Germany, Nordvolt, and so I think for institutions, it's one area to think about seriously for 2026. On those successful auctions in the UK, and potentially with projects already approved and contracted in Germany. Now that being said, that's the CapEx side of the business. Is there something to do for institutions on building platforms that could build the right infrastructure to service the large projects? That's something to think about, I believe. I think the jury is still out as to whether there's money to be made on the OPEX side of the business, if you will, with the huge critical mass that we see operating in Europe, 45 plus megawatts and gigawatts of installed capacity, and another 25 coming online. So servicing the build and the O&M side of that business, I believe is something to think about.
It's very interesting because what I wanted to touch on is obviously you made the shift from PSP, a large institutional investor, to Sandbrook, of course, a very successful investor as well, but very different profile as a specialist. And maybe tell us a bit about kind of the thinking when you made the shift, and talk a bit more about Sandbrook's expertise and what they've done in the past.
Yeah. So Sandbrook's DNA and background is energy and the energy space. The 5 founders that have all worked together in a previous shop decided to establish Sandbrook in 2021, got really up and running in 2022. And I've knowing them very well, having done transactions with them, having partnered with them in the past, and those 5 founders became really strong business friends. And the decision I made to join Sandbrook in early 2025 is just based on all of that expertise that sits, and how I can add and leverage better this whole expertise that exists around the energy space and the whole energy transition teams that are out there. And so at Sandbrook, when we think about offshore wind, and you've referred to Havfram, we can get into that transaction later, but it's, I think, a great example of how to leverage deep expertise in an industry and building a platform that can find its way into a gap that exists in the market. So the foundation or the DNA of Sandbrook is establishing investment theses that are based on deep industry knowledge, background, and expertise, and find that way where we can utilize the capital of our investors and our capital to create the right team that can build the right asset base to find its way into an industry that has a need across the energy spectrum. So really building expertise in portfolio companies to build the right infrastructure assets to either hold long term or service that specific sector is the deep expertise that we have built at Sandbrook. And the Havfram transaction is a great example of that.
I mean, that's a fascinating example of that success, and obviously we're quite familiar with it. But if let's dig in for some of the folks, talk a bit about the deal thesis and the timing of the Havfram deal. Of course, you were at PSP at the time and partnered with Sandbrook, but give us a bit around the core investment thesis for that opportunity.
That's right. I was I guess I have been on the two sides of that transaction, having underwritten it under my guard at PSP and having being part of selling jointly with PSP the whole transaction in 2025. So Havfram is a Norwegian established company that we co-bought between co-underwrote between Sandbrook and PSP, having bought from High Tech Vision, North European known investor that had established a business that was doing subsea, mostly oil and gas services and infrastructure for the industry. And building on the past expertise of some of the Sandbrook founders, having done a deal in construction vessels for offshore wind, a deal called CJAX, and very successfully. So building on that expertise, the story was a repeat and an improvement on that deal with Havfram. So the idea was to build the right team, assemble the right team to pivot from a very deep expertise in subsea offshore oil and gas specialization into installation vessels. And so the strategy and the investment thesis, the mandate for Havfram is to build vessels to service the next generation of wind projects in Europe. So the 20 megawatts plus turbines that are inevitable in the industry to make it viable. And so two hybrid electric ships to service, building two of those ships to service the industry. And the thesis was, you look at the European market, all of the committed projects that are underway and the pipeline of projects that's coming, and you look at the supply of vessels, and you can make the math through a deep industry analysis of what the imbalance looked like. And it became obvious during the course of 2022 when we were underwriting that deal that a big gap existed between 2026 and 2030, and beyond 2030, a lot of still unknown projects, but that gap was very likely to remain. And the gap, simply put, between the amount of vessels that would be needed to build those projects that are committed and moving forward versus the supply of vessels. And so we tapped that opportunity by creating Havfram, and the investment thesis proved itself very quickly. We were able to contract out the vessels, on the back of that, finance the vessels in a very efficient way with export credit financings, and with the $500 million of money committed by both by the combination of Sandbrook and PSP, we were able to advance the business plan and build the vessels. Now, we got inquiries during the back end of 24, if I get my dates right, from several strategics. So we were able to run a very competitive process. And DME, the very large Belgium vessel company and services companies to the space, was the winner, a very successful winner of the auction. So we ended up selling the investment after 2.5 years, realized the investment thesis, and exited in May of 25.
Yeah, I mean, that was a wonderfully successful transaction for all involved, I think. And it's interesting because, when we speak with other investors, there's, it's interesting to see the opportunity. Of course, when you map it out, the gap is, but it's one thing to see it and be able to execute and really deliver. So, what were the commercial structures and downside, protections? Of course, without disclosing anything confidential, but how, just to better understand how you look at future opportunities, how did you structure the Havfram, commercial model to be investable?
Yeah, it's a good question because there's different components of it, right? There's the revenue side that you can analyze through, proper modeling of supply demand imbalance, but there's also the execution side of the construction, and we all know, building vessels is not an easy task, whether they're very sophisticated wind turbines installation vessels or just ships in general. So the key is twofold, I think. The key is having the right team in place that can execute and oversee, and that was number one criteria. And from the CJAX experience, and that's some of the founding partners at Sandbrook had, we could identify the right component of teams that were needed to execute on this. So a very strong CEO with a deep maritime background on having also been involved in the shipping industry, and some execs that had deep understanding of building wind turbine installation vessels. One of them was CEO of Fred Olsen, a very successful wind turbine installation vessel business. And then at Sandbrook, we had the luxury of having another operating partner, like Andreas Nouwen, who was CEO of Siemens Gamesa for a long time. And so the combination of being able to look at people that have built vessels, done it, deep expertise in the shipping and the maritime industry, deep contacts, deep expertise in wind turbines and offshore wind turbines, as well as Siemens Gamesa is outside of China, the leader worldwide. And so the team that we had assembled, and we'd put Andreas as chairman of the board and very, very much involved with the management team on execution. And so the first very important criteria, having the right team in place and the right structure to incentivize them. Then the contractual and the commercial arrangements in terms of building the ship. And the Chinese yards are the most sophisticated and the most capable of executing. And the team had done it several times with Fred Olsen in China. And so we decided to go and establish that contractual arrangement on a fixed price, fixed time basis with the shipyard in China. And we had our people from Havfram, from Norway, established over there, working with the Chinese specialists and executing on it. And so it became quite clear, when this file fell on my desk in 2022 at PSP, the first reaction is, building 2 ships in China, that's not going to happen. I'm not doing that. And then you start looking at the team that was established by Sandbrook, and that's why I use Havfram to speak about how Sandbrook can leverage its expertise and how its DNA surfaced in this transaction. So a combination of the contacts to put the right people in the right company that had the right basis with subsea experience, but adding all of the vessels construction expertise to it, and contracting commercial as well. Though I'll come to that in a second. Then the partners within Sandbrook and the staff being able to demonstrate their expertise through establishing the right components, the contractual side, but also the people side, and then having the right contractual framework in place with yards that have done it, and with the right provisions, right LDs and all legal provisions required to do this. And so you combine all of this together and you look at the investment thesis, the big gap that exists to be able to contract out the revenue stream and build the ships, finance the ship, and be able to generate the right revenues. And you're like, yeah, it seems like it makes sense. And on top of that, you had the fact that the Sandbrook folks had done it with CJAX before, very successfully. And you're like, okay, but maybe it's worth a deeper look. And that's how at PSP we finally got comfortable and very comfortable with it. And when you go up the chain for approvals in a large institution, the first reaction from everybody is the same as the one I had. Yeah, building 2 ships in China, no way we're doing that. But with the right framework in place, everybody got comfortable, and the outcome is the outcome we've seen.
It's almost like putting the pieces of a puzzle, and with the right framework, the right people, commercial, contractual, and it also speaks to the depth of the offshore wind ecosystem as well, and that's something we talk about quite a bit. The necessity of the installation vessels, the ports, subsea cables, transmission, battery storage. It is really an ecosystem with strong benefits to local markets and communities. And that's fascinating. I want to touch on one last thing on the Havfram deal, because I think it's so relevant. On the exit to DEME and the lessons learned, on the sale of Havfram to DEME, what were the decisive value drivers that made the asset strategically compelling to a buyer? Like you mentioned, you had a process and quite a healthy appetite from the market, and then maybe was it backlog quality, the vessel specs, delivery schedule, integration synergies, and then looking back, what are the 2 or 3 lessons for offshore wind developers and investors in the space? Where value is being created today, whether it's generation assets or, the picks and shovels, as we say, the installation and cable and ports and O&M side.
I think the key of and why interest was raised by the strategic field in the space is they saw exactly what we saw 2 years before was unfolding. And so one, on the contractual side, projects moving forward, revenue contractual side, projects moving forward in needs of vessels. And then not only to make those projects viable, the type of turbines that needs to be utilized are the larger, latest technology, more heavy turbines, the kind of in between 15 and 20 megs of capacity, and coming up probably over 20 megs now. But the type of vessels that could handle those big monopiles is very, very limited. And so the 2 vessels that we were building at Havfram, are capable of lifting 3,000 pounds monopiles, and it is very heavy for a ship to lift. And so the capability of the vessel to match the requirement of the size of the turbines required to make the projects viable, combined with I think the fact that you're building clean energy, you have a clean energy mandate as a DMA or other strategic, and so the fact that those vessels were built and designed to generate 70% less of greenhouse gas emissions by being hybrid electric with direct current was quite attractive to the marketplace. But then, of course, we had also advanced the building of the ships. One of the two ships was almost finalized. 6 months later, we saw pictures in the 6 months after the announcement of the transaction in 2025. So in October, there was a large article in the Wall Street Journal. We had a big picture of the first vessel floating and being in the sea. Actually, it's quite nice to see. So congrats to Demini as well, who's finalized all of this and saw the opportunity. And I think that deal must be turning very well for them, I would imagine, especially with the Vattenfall announcement this week, which if you search a little, you'll see publicly known that they're going to utilize the Havfram Demi vessels. So I think that's the key to generate attractiveness is execute properly on your original investment thesis, and once you've de-risked some of the elements, the market shows up. Does that answer your question? What was the second part of your question again?
Yeah, just some lessons learned, and I think we'll touch on the second piece. I want to move to the OPEX conversation and your focus at Sandbrook today, and what areas across the offshore wind ecosystem are you most excited about at Sandbrook? To obviously a great case study in Havfram. Are you looking at specific areas? You talked about OPEX. Tell us a bit more kind of how you're looking at the opportunities set at this point.
Yeah. So during the course of 2025, or I guess the back end of 2024, we came to the conclusion that the CapEx side of the business was becoming more and more challenging. Well, in the US, we saw in Europe, there was a big halt. We was just on the back of the two failed auctions in the UK and in Germany. So, although we were still very comfortable with our investment in Havfram because of, the committed projects and everything that was advancing, the dynamic of successful future project was evolving. And so we started to think about whether it would make sense to play in the OPEX side of the business, providing the right infrastructure as a service to project developers and the big players. And in Europe, obviously RWE, Vattenfall, Ørsted are the three dominant players, very, very deep balance sheet, but their appetite to play on the OPEX side has been variable over time. And the turbine manufacturers, there was a time when they were providing full-on services. That model didn't exactly go as planned for them, and so self-perform became a wave of fashionable thing to do. That didn't go super well neither. So whether there's a space in the market to create the right platform to offer infrastructure as a service to establish a successful investment thesis there is something that certainly piqued our curiosity quite seriously. And with the help of Andreas and all the existing expertise that exists at Sandbrook, we dug quite deep into that. Now, I think the jury's still out as to whether there's something there or not. We haven't really made our mind. I think the development that we've seen this week in Europe with 8 or 9 gigs auction today in the UK, and some projects moving forward. Is that going to improve the dynamic and provide a better need? I think it's something to watch for 2026. But I'll say, in summary, I think jury's still out as to whether there's something to be done there. You want to be careful with the volatility that's embedded in shorter term contractual framework for the OPEX side of the business, and you want to be careful not to repeat the mistakes that have been done by the wind turbine manufacturers in providing contracts that aren't financially viable, or the mistakes that have been done on the self-perform side by the project developers.
Yeah, I think, Patrick, there's definitely a couple of pieces of value there, OPEX as a service, or I guess, are you thinking more on the O&M side? For obviously, there's a significant fleet of operating assets, but also is it like an installation as a service offering as well on the other side, or which buckets of value are you thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, the installation to me is the CapEx side of the business, right? So you're dealing with new projects, construction issues. Now, whether you're going to deal with repowering at one point, probably, once those turbines are up in the sea, there's no reason why you would just dismantle them. But yeah, no, on more thinking about the O&M side of the business, in providing an obvious one are the ships that are providing the people to manage the business. But this business is evolving, technology's getting very deep into it. So whether you can be in front of new technologies to test, do preventive maintenance, do corrective maintenance tasks, and offer your infrastructure either as moving people or general equipment or technology that's required to perform the O&M side of the business, is really what I'm referring to.
That makes sense. And we're definitely seeing use cases for AI and drones and robotics and so on. So that'll be an interesting space to see how that impacts, the traditional business.
Absolutely. And climate change, with more protective, defensive measures being needed to ensure that those turbines stay up, are certainly a theme that's something to think about.
One thing for sure is the amount of operating assets continues to grow. The fleet is significant. Whether it's the UK or Germany or a couple of the other markets. So maybe just just to tie that back to, some of the folks, the offshore wind developers or the business operators in the ecosystem, what advice would you give to CEOs? As a senior advisor, you've been on boards, you've worked on, with many companies. What's the number one piece of advice you'd give a CEO across the offshore wind ecosystem who's struggling to raise their next, round of equity?
A very interesting question. I think very relevant. And so, a CEO of an established business in offshore wind, by definition, has the right reflexes. You're not in that seat if you don't have background expertise and having had the right reflexes in the past. And when I look at how some capital providers and strategic players have been influenced by the waves and the hypes that we have seen in the US at one point, but in Europe at another, and to a certain extent, probably lesser extent in Asia Pacific, but certainly at some point in Taiwan. So, you go back to 2022 in the US when people paid north of $6 billion US for offshore leases off the East Coast. And some of those single leases going for $1 billion. You had a 7 to 12 years of development period in front of you, but you had to put several billions of dollars up front to acquire the lease. Yep, something doesn't feel right in there. And people were chasing down or chasing up the price, chasing down returns, chasing up the price of those leases as a few auctions have taken place. And the last one that occurred was really a big hype. Now, I'll come back to why I'm talking about this, but I'll do the same with the UK. When you've seen, this week was the 7th auction in the UK. They've been doing auctions since 2015. It started at very high prices. Of course, the auctions over there are CFDs with a floor. So contract for difference with a floor. So quite attractive structure actually for financial investors. But the pricings started very high, creeped down to AP4, AP4 was the peak, I think, where prices went down materially, and then what we've seen since then is no good, and then things creeping up back again in terms of prices. But I participated with developers, and Dong or Ørsted at the time was a big leader, and we certainly, what one of my investors was calling, we chased down returns, and we always missed by 100 bips on those auctions. But at one point, when prices were getting in the 30s, a megawatt hour for building offshore wind, like, you look at this and something doesn't feel right. And so my coming back to my advice is, when you see a hype in an industry, of course there's a fear of missing out, but your guts and your instinct resurface, and when something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. And I think that Fort auction in the UK and some of the US experience demonstrates that.
That's very good advice, actually. I follow your gut is, definitely.
Well, of course, you don't deploy billions by just following your guts, but you have the right analysis. But when the right people have produced the right analysis, and you look at the different components, and everything has to go right everywhere in order for the investment thesis to be successful, that's when it starts not to feel right.
Very good advice. Maybe on that note, I always like to end with a question for the younger generation to continue to inspire and have more folks join the industry. And if you had to look back and give some advice to your 20-year-old self about the industry, about the sector, the opportunities, the challenges, what would you say?
Interesting question. I think about quite often, actually. And when I reflect on things I should have done, or things I shouldn't have done, or things I've done well, follow your conviction. Follow your conviction, but build your conviction with facts, with deep analysis, with the right people around you. So, in an industry like infrastructure and offshore wind, it's so deeply specialized. It's so complex. There's so moving pieces. I like the analogy of the puzzle you were talking about, but it's not only bringing all the pieces of the puzzle together, it's bringing all the pieces of the puzzle together at the same time. So, completing a puzzle is easy. It takes time. You put every piece there. But in putting together a successful project, you need to put all the pieces of the puzzle together at the same time. They all have to fall apart, to fall down on your table, right, or at the same time. So you need to have the right people, the right analysis, the right information based on factual things, not opinions. And then you build your conviction around it, and then you follow your conviction hard on both sides, doing projects or just moving on from investment opportunities. Because in offshore wind, I've done 4 projects. If I can't Havfram twice on both sides of PSP and Sandbrook, but I've probably looked at I don't know, 100 and deeply into 25 right to the last minute. And on some of them, we had very strong convictions, and sometimes we missed out because we didn't follow our convictions enough, and missed out by a few bits of required return. But similarly, some of the mistakes I've done were by not being disciplined enough in following the convictions.
So really following your conviction, being surrounded by the right people, and so on. And I know we're over time, but we could I'm sure talk for another hour. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you again, Patrick, and I always enjoy our conversations, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Equally, thank you for inviting me and having me here, Philip.